In the early 2000s, one company practically owned the entire world. If you held a cell phone, it was almost certainly a Nokia. In 2007, they controlled an unbelievable 49.4% of the global market. That means for every 2 smartphones sold on the entire planet, one of them was theirs. At their peak, they dominated the global mobile market and reached a staggering valuation of $250 billion. They were completely untouchable. But then, almost overnight, the empire vanished. Most people will tell you that Steve Jobs and the Apple iPhone killed Nokia, but that is a lie, or at least only a fraction of the truth. The real story behind Nokia's catastrophic collapse is much darker. It involves a secret operating system that could have easily destroyed the iPhone, a disastrous internal memo, and a Trojan Horse CEO who orchestrated one of the greatest corporate sabotages in human history. This isn't just a story about a tech giant failing to adapt. This is the $250 billion mystery of how an invincible empire secretly destroyed itself from the inside.
Welcome to Wealth Memoir.
To understand how a giant falls, you first have to look at how high they climbed. By the year 2007, Nokia wasn't just a tech company, they were an absolute global monopoly. At their absolute peak, they controlled over half of the entire global mobile phone market, and in some regions, their dominance pushed past 70%. Their market capitalization hovered around a staggering $250 billion. They had the most efficient supply chain in the world, the best hardware engineers, and a brand recognition that rivaled Coca-Cola. This unimaginable success bred something very dangerous inside Nokia's boardroom, a deeply rooted corporate arrogance. They developed the illusion of invincibility. The executives began to believe that consumers would blindly buy absolutely anything as long as it had the Nokia logo stamped on it. While a quiet revolution was brewing in Silicon Valley, where visionary engineers were starting to view cell phones as pocket-sized computers driven by software, Nokia remained obsessively focused on hardware. They truly believed that the future of mobile innovation was physical luxury. So they poured massive resources into their luxury sub-brand called Virtu. Instead of writing better code or improving their clunky user interface, Nokia was busy wrapping cell phones in solid gold, encrusting them with diamonds and rubies, and selling them to billionaires for tens of thousands of dollars. They were convinced that a premium device meant premium materials, not a premium operating system. This fatal hardware obsession created a massive corporate blind spot. They were looking down from their golden tower, completely unaware that the fundamental rules of the entire tech industry were about to be rewritten overnight.
In January 2007, Steve Jobs walked onto a stage in San Francisco and pulled a rectangular piece of glass out of his pocket. He called it the iPhone. It had no physical keyboard, a battery that barely lasted a single day, and a screen that shattered if you dropped it on the floor. Inside Nokia's headquarters in Finland, executives reportedly laughed. By their strict, world-class hardware standards, the iPhone was a terrible device. They confidently predicted that no serious business professional or everyday consumer would ever buy a phone without a physical keypad. But this arrogance blinded them to a terrifying reality. Apple wasn't just selling a phone. They were selling a pocket-sized computer that simply happened to make phone calls. While Apple and Google were aggressively revolutionizing software, creating intuitive, gesture-based touch interfaces and smooth user experiences, Nokia was stubbornly holding on to Symbian. It was an incredibly outdated, clunky operating system originally built for the push-button era, and it was an absolute nightmare for developers to write code for it. But here is a dark truth that most people get wrong. Nokia actually realized the importance of applications before Apple did. They launched their own platform called the Ovi Store ahead of the competition. However, the internal corporate bureaucracy at Nokia was so toxic and slow that developers took months of exhausting paperwork, endless testing, and exorbitant fees just to get a simple application approved. Apple, on the other hand, threw the doors wide open, making it incredibly easy and profitable for developers to populate the App Store. Nokia had the right idea, but their massive corporate weight and paralyzing red tape strangled their own innovation. By the time they finally realized that software, not hardware, was the true battleground, the giant was officially bleeding. But the real betrayal was yet to come. The biggest lie told about Nokia's downfall is that they simply didn't have the technology to fight back against Apple. The truth is much sinister. They did, and it was spectacular. In 2011, while the world was obsessing over the iPhone, Nokia released a device that shocked the tech community, the N9. But it wasn't running their outdated Symbian software. It was powered by a brand new, highly secretive operating system called MeGo. MeGo was an absolute masterpiece. It was incredibly fast, beautifully designed, and built entirely around a fluid, swipe-based gesture system. Keep in mind, this was years before Apple introduced similar swipe gestures to the masses. Tech critics who got their hands on the N9 were absolutely blown away. Many prominent reviewers immediately dubbed it the true iPhone killer. It was the exact life raft Nokia needed to save their sinking empire and reclaim their throne. But then, something inexplicable happened, something that still baffles tech historians to this day. Almost immediately after the Nokia N9 launched to rave reviews, the company announced that they were completely abandoning the MeGo operating system. They weren't going to make any more devices with it. They took their ultimate weapon, the exact technology that could have secured their future, and they deliberately strangled it in its crib. Why would a dying company intentionally destroy its own savior? The answer wasn't a market failure. It wasn't a lack of consumer interest or a shortage of funding. The answer was a single man who had just walked into the CEO's office. A man who was about to execute one of the most controversial corporate takeovers in modern history.
In late 2010, Nokia's board of directors made a historic and desperate decision. For the first time in their 145-year history, they hired a non-Finnish chief executive officer to salvage the bleeding company. His name was Stephen Elop. But Elop wasn't just any corporate executive. He was a former high-ranking leader from Microsoft. When Elop took the reins, he didn't try to restructure Nokia's internal bureaucracy, nor did he push their breakthrough MeGo software to the global market. Instead, his actions resembled a man executing a calculated demolition order. Almost immediately, he sidelined Nokia's dedicated software engineers. He officially declared that the highly praised MeGo project was completely dead, effectively suffocating Nokia's only legitimate defense against Apple and Google before it had a chance to breathe. But the ultimate shockwave hit the industry just months later. Elop announced that Nokia would completely abandon its own software heritage. Instead,
They would exclusively adopt Microsoft's Windows Phone as their sole smartphone platform. The tech world was stunned. Nokia was willfully surrendering its independence to become a mere hardware vessel for a struggling Microsoft ecosystem, a platform that had virtually no market share and a severely empty app store. To this day, a dark debate rages in the financial and tech communities. Was Stephen Elop simply an incompetent CEO making a disastrously flawed strategic pivot? Or was he acting as a Trojan horse, a corporate infiltrator planted to artificially crash Nokia's value, strip away their proprietary software, and perfectly position the vulnerable tech giant for an eventual pennies-on-the-dollar buyout by his former employers? In February 2011, Stephen Elop released an internal company memo that would go down in history as the most spectacularly destructive document ever written by a sitting CEO. It was famously titled the Burning Platform Memo. In this letter, Elop compared Nokia to a man standing on a blazing oil rig, forced to jump into freezing dark waters just to survive. He publicly declared to the entire world that Nokia's proprietary software platforms, Symbian and the highly praised MeeGo, were essentially dead. He announced that Nokia would be making a radical jump, transitioning entirely to Microsoft's Windows Phone ecosystem. But there was one catastrophic problem with this bold announcement. Nokia didn't actually have any Windows phones ready to sell. In fact, it would take nearly a full year before the very first Nokia-branded Windows device would even hit the market. By publicly announcing that their current line of products was totally obsolete long before any replacements were available to buy, Elop triggered a devastating economic phenomenon known as the Osborne effect. He had practically broadcasted a message to the global market, begging them to stop buying Nokia phones. And the market listened. Overnight, consumers halted their purchases. Global mobile carriers refused to stock the inventory, and software developers completely abandoned the platform. After all, why would anyone invest their money or time into a smartphone that the company's own CEO had just publicly executed? Sales collapsed instantly. Billions of dollars in market value and revenue evaporated into thin air in a matter of months. This wasn't a competitive assassination by Apple or Google. It was a completely self-inflicted billion-dollar suicide. Nokia had successfully set their own platform on fire long before they ever bothered to build a lifeboat. As the fires of the Osborne effect ravaged Nokia's Western markets, the bleeding empire desperately retreated to its final, undisputed fortresses, the massive, emerging markets of India and Bangladesh. For decades, Nokia had been the absolute king of these regions. To the billions of people living there, a mobile phone wasn't just a device, it was simply called a Nokia. With Apple and Samsung completely dominating the premium smartphone wars in the US and Europe, Nokia's executives hatched a desperate survival plan. They would flood South Asia with the Asha series, a line of ultra-cheap, colorful feature phones that looked like smartphones but ran on severely limited, outdated software. They believed the immense volume of sales in India and Bangladesh would act as a financial life support system while Microsoft figured out how to fix the Windows Phone disaster. But Nokia severely underestimated a brand new, invisible enemy. An enemy that wasn't born in Silicon Valley, but in the sprawling manufacturing hubs of Shenzhen, China. Almost overnight, local homegrown brands began to rise from the shadows. In India, it was a company called Micromax. In Bangladesh, it was a brand named Symphony. These local companies executed a brilliantly ruthless strategy. They didn't waste billions of dollars on research and development or proprietary software. Instead, they tapped directly into the cheap Chinese supply chain, importing generic, low-cost Android smartphones and slapping their own local logos on them. Suddenly, consumers in Delhi and Dhaka faced a critical choice. Buy a basic Nokia feature phone that could barely open a web browser, or buy a Symphony or Micromax device for the exact same price. A device that offered a large touchscreen, thousands of free Android applications, and decent cameras. It was an absolute slaughter. The Android revolution had arrived in South Asia, armed with cheap Chinese manufacturing, and it completely decimated Nokia's Asha strategy. Within a remarkably short window, Symphony captured the Bangladeshi market, and Micromax became a titan in India. Nokia's final desperate stronghold, the very last pillar holding up their once mighty global empire, was ruthlessly brought down by local upstarts they hadn't even bothered to notice. The giant was finally on its knees, waiting for the executioner. By late 2013, Nokia was entirely unrecognizable from the $250 billion titan that had once ruled the globe. Their market share in the West had been completely obliterated by Apple and Google. Their final stronghold in South Asia had just been overrun by cheap Android alternatives. The company was bleeding billions, its stock price was decimated, and they were hopelessly trapped in a Microsoft software ecosystem that nobody wanted to buy. The stage was perfectly set for the final act of this corporate tragedy. In September 2013, Microsoft swooped in like a vulture circling a dying animal. They announced they were purchasing Nokia's entire mobile device business. The price tag? A mere $7.2 billion. To put that into perspective, Microsoft bought the entire legacy of the greatest mobile empire in history for less than they paid for the video calling app Skype. But the darkest detail of this acquisition wasn't the humiliating price, it was the fate of Stephen Elop. Immediately following the sale, Elop stepped down as the CEO of Nokia. He seamlessly transitioned back to his former employer, Microsoft, taking up a highly lucrative executive position. And as a reward for his time at Nokia, a tenure characterized by massive layoffs, the deliberate destruction of their proprietary software, and the total collapse of their global market share, Elop walked away with a staggering $25 million severance bonus. To this day, the debate echoes through the halls of Silicon Valley and Wall Street. Was Stephen Elop simply the worst CEO in modern tech history? Or did he successfully execute the most brilliant, ruthless corporate infiltration ever conceived? He walked into a $250 billion empire, methodically burned its defenses to the ground, and handed the ashes to Microsoft for pennies on the dollar. The giant was officially dead, and the puppet master had been paid.
The spectacular collapse of Nokia stands as the ultimate corporate cautionary tale. It is a terrifying reminder that no empire, no matter how powerful or financially dominant, is ever truly too big to fail. Nokia didn't die because they lacked money, engineering talent, or global reach. They died because of pure arrogance. They were so blinded by their past successes that they stubbornly refused to see the future until it had already destroyed them. They built an absolute fortress of hardware and arrogantly assumed the world would never change its mind.
But the dark reality of the modern corporate world is that empires are always shifting. While old giants like Nokia crumble into dust, other much darker shadows are quietly rising, consuming the global economy on a scale that makes Nokia's peak look entirely insignificant. We are no longer just dealing with companies that want to sell you a mobile phone. We're dealing with unseen institutions that want to own absolutely everything you touch. If you want to know who is really pulling the strings of the global economy today, click the video on your screen right now to watch The Company That Owns the Entire World, BlackRock. I will see you there.